Now let's look at a quick demo showing how we can add some functionality to some generated test code. For this recording, we're going to look at the Browse Add to Cart web test that we recorded in the last module. This particular web test has a number of different requests in it, and you can see that we parameterized our web server and called it Web Server 1 in an earlier part of the test, but later on we added some additional requests and we did not parameterize these. To generate the code, you simply click on the Generate Code button shown here, and this will generate a class like the one that we did in the last module, this Browse Add to Cart Coded.cs. If we examine this code, you'll see at the top that it tells us that this code was generated by a tool and any changes will be lost if the code is regenerated. Looking through the code, we can see that the parameterized web server is specified here in the context, and for the early requests, these are referring to this context to get that web server. If we scroll down to later requests, we see that they do not have that. Instead, they have the hard-coded localhost. And in the previous module, we added a bit of behavior to this, where we selected the genre from a private string here called getGenre. Now, I want to show why this is not a best practice if you want to have code that's easy for you to maintain. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back up to our web test, and we're going to make some updates to it. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to parameterize the rest of these web servers. So we'll click on this button here and say OK. And now we've parameterized the rest of those web servers. So we need to regenerate our code. And we're going to call it Browse Add to Cart Coded. We'll call it 2 just so we don't overwrite our original code that we had. And now if we look through this code, of course, it no longer has our getGenre code, and it also doesn't have those calls in there anymore. So in the case of this call here, we can say go to usages, and we can find these usages are here. So on request 2, we're making a call to getGenre. Likewise on request 3 and request 4, request 5. If we look at our new generated code and we jump up to request 2, obviously that code has been lost and the genre is now hard-coded once again. The best practice if you're going to be working with these coded tests is to try and keep as much custom code in separate classes as possible. So what I would recommend is to add a folder for these sort of test helpers. And in this case, we can simply add a class that will do our genre selection. So maybe we'll call this genres. And with this class, we'll just move that class or that method that we had before. So we can say this getGenre string can come out of this class and move in here. And we can make this public and static because it's not requiring anything. Save that, and then our original coded test here isn't going to know how to find those unless we add a reference to it. So we'll call this genres.getGenre and add that namespace. And we'll change that in each place where it's used. And see if we can build. Now at this point our original test still works, but of course it doesn't have the parameterized web server. So if we want to add this genres.getGenre into our new test, we can do that here, replacing any of these hard-coded genre strings. Now there's not really an easy way to eliminate completely the need for you to make these sorts of changes unless you data bind your entire source. So in this case, these test requests are coming in. These are from actual recorded requests where I was clicking on different options and these query string parameters were being set. If I wanted to do this a little bit differently, I could have only a single request do that work, and then I could use data binding to make it so that it perhaps did multiple requests, one per row of my data in there, instead of using this sort of helper. So there's different ways to achieve the same sort of behavior in this case. Since I've chosen to go ahead and hard code these selections here, rather than using data binding, I'm stuck with having to make these manual changes within my generated code anytime I regenerate it. However, I have at least now made it so I won't lose my custom code when I regenerate because I've put it into its own class. And so that's the improvement that we've made by pushing this into its own class. So that concludes this demo. You can see what the challenges are when you work with the generated code, and you can see why it's important that you have as much of this code set up before you generate it as possible. One last thing I want to point out is the use of data binding. In the last demo, we set up a number of different data sources on the successful login. You can see there's 3 of them here. When you generate the code for this particular test, you'll see that there is a lot of code set up for you in these attributes for those data sources. And so that's why you want to make sure that you set the data sources up before you generate code, because coding all of this stuff up by hand would get to be very tedious and error prone. Now, you'd only have probably 1 data source, not 3, so you wouldn't have quite as much as is shown here, but it's still much easier to let the tool do that for you than for you to try and code that by hand.